this edition of the Times Techies webinar series. My name is Shilpa Fadnis and I have my colleague Sujit John with me. Both of us are technology and business journalists at the Times of India, and we will be moderating today's discussion. We hope you and your families are staying safe and doing well. Our hearts go out to those who've lost their loved ones battling COVID-19. Our discussion today is with a group of people who are deeply involved in developing a solution to the healthcare crisis that we are in the midst of. The project to build an indigenous low-cost ventilator is being led by researchers at the Center for Nanoscience and Engineering, CeNSE, at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. CeNSE was established in 2010 to pursue interdisciplinary research across several disciplines with a focus on nanoscale systems. Three of those with us today are a part of the center.
We have with us Professor Srinivasan Raghavan. Professor Raghavan is the chairperson of the center. He holds a Ph.D. in material science and engineering from the Pennsylvania State University and ME in metallurgy from IISc. His research interests include growth of thin films and nanostructures, among others. Welcome, Professor Raghavan.
Thank you.
We have with us Professor Sushobhan Avasthi. Professor Avasthi has been at IISc since 2014. He has a Ph.D. in electrical engineering from Princeton University. His research interests include high-efficiency thin-film solar cells, integration of semiconductor oxides to silicon, among other areas. Welcome, Professor Avasthi.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We have with us Harshvardhan Gupta. Harshvardhan is called the Master Craftsman at CeNSE. He's currently pursuing his Ph.D. at IISc. He holds a B.Tech in Mechanical Engineering from the National Institute of Technology, Surathkal, an MS in Mechatronics from F.H. Aachen University of Applied Sciences in Germany. He worked for 2 years at Tata Technologies. Welcome, Harsha.
We have with us Dr. Justin Gopaldas. Dr. Gopaldas is a consultant for critical care medicine at Manipal hospitals. He is the member of organizations such as Canadian Critical Care, the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine, and Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency. Welcome, Dr. Gopaldas. And we have with us Anoop Varghese. Mr. Varghese is the Chief Operating Officer at Vasmed Health Sciences. He has over 21 years of medical device experience in product development, product marketing, regulatory approval, and business management. He was previously Senior Global Product Manager at Philips Healthcare. Welcome, Mr. Varghese.
Thank you.
Those of you who are viewing this can send in questions through the Facebook comment box. Sujit and I will put them to the panelists. Without much ado, I will hand it over to Professor Raghavan. Over to you, sir.
So I'm going to share my screen now, and I hope you can see.
Yeah,
my
it's
screen.
coming, yeah.
Yeah, just a second here. I don't know how this went down. Yeah. Okay, so am I live and can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Glad to be here. Thank you to the Times of India team for allowing us to present our work on this platform, this webinar. I'm told it's an exciting place to be in, and I hope you all enjoy the story that we are about to share with you today. My name is Vasu. I'm a faculty member at the Center for Nanoscience and Engineering, as Shilpi just pointed out, and you are most welcome to ask any questions that you may have, even during the course of the webinar. It needs to be a freewheeling discussion. We've just put together a presentation for the sake of enabling this discussion that we have. The story that we are going to share with you is one of having made this indigenous ICU grade ventilator. This is the image that you see on the right. And the story of how a group of people, the 5 of us here, and many, many more, you will see them, have worked on it for about 16 odd months to enable it. That's the exciting story that you will hear. There have been many more efforts, both at IISc and around the world, as you may have heard. Within IISc itself, there have been 2 ventilator efforts, 2 oxygen concentrator efforts, and many, many more in response to this COVID emergency we are facing. And these are all stories of the human spirit that go to tell us that if we raise up to a challenge and if we persevere, then we can overcome any challenge that's presented to us. Okay. And in the process of making this ventilator, I must say at the outset, I developed great respect for all those companies that are developing biomedical equipment that are out there in the market, because we realized that the human body is a very, very delicate piece of equipment to work with. It can be easily damaged. And therefore, we approach this whole problem not as a hobby, but as a very serious effort. Okay, so with that, let me get started. Nothing can be done without a team. And this is from with Times of India's permission. I'm guessing this is a Times of India platform, so I can take this photograph from Jan 20, 2021. I'm sorry, was there a question? When we won this fantastic series in Australia. It's bittersweet from the point of view of this program. It tells us that we need to put a team together in the first place. But what it also tells us, and when I was thinking back today morning as I was making this presentation, it tells us that to some extent, as COVID was creeping up upon us, we had forgotten the fact that it was out there in spite of what we went through last August. So the first thing that we need to do when we have to make a group of techies need to make something like an ICU ventilator is we need to put together a team. Okay, so this is the team. And there are many photographs here. Down there, you see many other members of the support team. We call them the support team, but without their critical contributions, we wouldn't be here today. But these 5 members are the ones who are the current panelists, and they will be talking to you. In particular, I would like to highlight the fact that Professor Sushobhan Avasthi is now the master ringleader. Okay, Harshvardhan Gupta is a master of all trades. Of course, we've been fortunate to work with Justin, who's been giving his medical expertise, and Anoop, who's been giving his biomedical equipment expertise as we speak. My name is Vasu, and you can address me as such. And we have this fantastic team that we worked with since January of 2020. If you need more details, our entire story is there on this website, CeNSE.iisc.ac.in/ventilator. Take a look at it. I would like to acknowledge IISc and the Society for Innovation and Development at IISc for their funding. As we speak, like I said, this is not a toy that we've produced. It's a proper prototype. And Vasmed is scaling up production. So I'll tell you that we are working towards making 30 pieces by the end of this month, or 25 pieces by the end of this month. So if you're looking for if we are looking for funding to scale up production, so if you're interested in funding us, please let us know. We are, for example, in touch with companies like Western Digital, who have expressed such an interest. You can also look up tatpar-sid.ac.in as a single point of contact window. Okay, I must issue an apology before I go ahead. In case I have used web-based resources and without giving due credit, I hope they will excuse me, but it is with the spirit and intent of communicating a message in these times of emergency, and a message that might be helpful and it might help save lives. Okay. So our story spans this timeline. We started on the 19th of March, 2020. The story, hopefully, the first bit of the story will end on the 30th of May, 2022, when we make our first 25 units. And as of now, we are here on the 12th of May, 2021. Okay, sorry, 12th of May, 2021. Sorry, this is going to end on 30th of May, 2021. My apologies, not 2022. Okay. So when we first started and this whole COVID emergency came about, I'm a guy who's used to sending gases through systems and, pumping them out. And I called my good friend, Dr. Justin, and I said, okay, what is it that's needed? Remember, this was a time back in January to March timeframe when stories were coming out of Italy that there will be a big gap in the supply demand as far as healthcare is concerned if COVID strikes India, and that ventilators will be in great demand. So we did some quick math and we found out that the number of ventilators that are available in a place like Bangalore would just not be enough to meet the demand. Now, of course, the need is more for oxygen concentrators than ventilators. So I quickly asked Justin as to what it is that a ventilator does. And if you look up the concept of an emergency ventilator on YouTube, you will see that it's essentially a bellow that kind of pumps air into your lung and out. Okay. So are you just hearing me, or are you hearing some commentary from my computer as well?
No, we can only hear you.
Excellent. That's how I want it to be.
Okay.
So that's what a ventilator essentially does, the simplest form of a ventilator. Okay. Of course, building a ICU grade high-end medical ventilator, which is a very, very complicated machine, is a far cry from this world. But then when I asked Justin as to what we could do to help the emergency, and he said, this is what you need to look at. Oops, excuse me, I don't know why. Okay. And this is how we started. This is how our thought process started. And then we looked at everything possible that we could do to pump air into a person, including, can we use a bicycle pump, and you must have seen stories of people using all kinds of things from countries like Colombia and so on and so forth to pump air into an individual who needs air and is not able to do so on their own, that they use all kinds of contraptions. And this is how our thought process also started way back then. And I just want you to keep this in mind, because when you see what the end product is now, you will see it's a far cry, but a lot of product development conceptually starts from or has such rudimentary beginnings. However, this was one of our very first ideas, that we would have a cam, there would be a spring mechanism, and as the cam rotated, the spring mechanism would kind of pump air into an individual and then take it out. And if you go and do a quick Google search, you will find that one of the big aircraft companies in the world actually put out such an emergency ventilator sometime back. But then I ended up talking to Justin, and as we went along, we understood better as to what the critical needs of the human body are from the point of view of ventilation. And after having spoken to him, we decided that we wouldn't just make a simple emergency ventilator. We would try and go ahead and make the most sophisticated ventilator that we possibly could in the time frame that was available to us. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand you over to Justin, who will now tell us as to what it is that he as a doctor looks forward to from a ventilator, from a mechanistic point of view, and why it is so important in these COVID times. So over to you, Justin. I have this brief cartoon here to help you explain what a ventilator does.
Good evening. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Vasmed. So I think most of us won't need a ventilator, and the need for ventilator for us comes when our lungs fail to do their basic job, and that we can't compensate anymore with our human body. I'm sure most of us had gone for a run, and at some point we tire out because lungs can't pump anymore and get rid of the lactate, so we would stop. But whereas when you are facing what we call as a critical illness, that's what happens to the body, there is no stopping. So body is not designed or trained to deal with non-stop exercise. And at some point, if you are going on a treadmill and somebody says that I won't switch it on or switch it off, and you will say at some point, I don't mind falling down, I would stop, even if it's going to injure you. So that is essentially what is going to happen with some of the patients that we tend to see in our intensive care units, is somebody who's trying to compensate as much as they can for the low oxygen levels that happens with COVID pneumonia in this pandemic time. And they go to an extent where they no longer can do so and really need an artificial way of helping them out. I know that we have a very bad view of ventilator because we think ventilator is equal to badness, but it is because we only need ventilator when we are so sick. It isn't because if you give ventilator that somebody gets sick. So that's the equation that I probably want to impress upon people. and we should not necessarily be using ventilator as a CPR, where we give CPR only when somebody doesn't have a heartbeat or breath, whereas where we use a ventilator before patient stops running, so that we help them out. And this is essentially trying to see that where the main problem is getting the air from outside your body into the blood so that it gets supplied to the various parts of the body, and various parts of the body work well until lungs heal themselves up. So that duration, when we can't do it on our own, without oxygen or with oxygen, or sometimes in this case with the ventilator help. So what ventilator does, other than regular oxygen, is provide a lot more faster air flow into the lungs than when we are too tired. Number two, that it would provide you with a lot more pressure that would keep the lungs open, and it would allow you to send in a higher concentration of oxygen than any other device that can be, so that we maximize the utilization of the lungs. So ventilators aren't a replacement for lungs, but they maximize the utility of a diseased lung and buy us time long enough for the body to heal or lungs to heal or both, and then we get off it when we are a bit better. So this is the understanding behind why we use ventilator and where we use ventilators. And coming to the ventilators per se, we understand that the choice of the patient, the times that we use, and the ways we use, as we're probably going to be discussing a little bit later, are different for the different phases of pneumonia. On the first day, you need a ventilator that gives you maximum oxygen, so that you get as much oxygen. And when you start getting better, it should be able to allow you to do more or less more and more work as the time goes by, allowing you to slowly and gradually come off the ventilator and you take your control. So these all need various sophisticated, not only hardware, but also software in these machines, which have been forever tuned in the industry for nearly 15 to 20 years. That's why they're all very patented, very expensive. And some of these most commonly used ventilators in India are anywhere between 14 to 28 lakh rupees, a single piece that we generally use in our ICUs. They last long, but essentially that's where the money goes, because of the amount of money that is spent developing these softwares where the right programs to adjust these artificial breathing to natural breathing as much as possible. And the second most the important aspect about a medical health is all about do no harm. So that's the second bit about it, is that as much as ventilator is likely to give you pressure and buy you time and give you oxygen, but it is also not natural. The breathing is artificial, as we rightly so pointed, and that it provides pressure and flow, which is much different than how you and I breathe together. So we suck air, generate drag, whereas the ventilator pushes air, and that leads to some amount of lung stress, and sometimes makes lungs a lot more vulnerable on their own. So a therapy that has double-edged sword, and so we want to use it as less as possible. And so we can't have a half-hearted effort at a ventilator, and that is going to be precise for us to be able to avoid harm as well. So these are the principles that we discussed when WASU came about, and then we stuck to those principles where even if the machine isn't at its precise, but it shouldn't be causing harm. And with that starting point, our journey started, and by the time we come to D3, as they will discuss what D3 is, we come to a point where we have made a journey what took nearly 12 years for software companies, all these advanced companies, to make software, that this team has put together in 12 months by writing so many codes to be able to adapt and to write so many other what we call as a modes of ventilation, where it allows more and more control to the patient, or different types of ways I could maximize the lungs. So these are all the modes and settings, and the codes for it have been made by this team in a matter of 12 months, which obviously took 12 years or so in the past for those companies, and that's called wartime work. And I'm sure you've heard about wartime inventions, and this is probably one of those wartime inventions that I can see from IISc team, and I'm quite happy to be part of it, because as much as my daily life in ICU is a lot more dreary and very often most of the days have been not so happy, I ended up going to IISc, meeting these people and getting a renewed energy to go back and have that what we call as a grit in me to sustain this pandemic. And I thank the team for asking me to be part of it. And I'll let Vasu explain and the team explain rest of the bits of invention, and hope I made sense. Thank you.
There's a related question from this. I think, Doctor, you might be able to answer this. I see the product is pushing air into lungs directly. Do human lungs accept whatever air we pump in through any mechanism?
Obviously, for us to...
That is a question from Sujit Reddy.
Yep. So hi, Sujit. So generally, when we are awake, we fight it. If you are not so awake, we fight less. And if you are completely unconscious, it is a lot more easier. Even when we are unconscious, we try to fight an airflow that comes. I'm sure we have seen this, isn't it? An air comes and we close eyes. So as a natural response, we generally tend to avoid anything that is not initiated by us. So this is where the whole concept of machine and the human interaction and limiting asynchrony, what we call one of the ways why the design had to go through so many phases of development to limit that effect, so that we time it so well. So most of the times we time the machine in cases where patient is not conscious, is not unconscious, in which case patient is able to breathe. And so we time the breath. Whenever they generate a breath, that airflow in is a flow change. And with that flow, machine triggers and understands that there is air going. I must assist the patient now, and it flows the air. So that's one way of doing it. And if patient is unconscious and really sick, we really sedate them to an extent where we take full control of the patient, at which time we would choose how fast and how slow the air will go in. Sometimes it is so stiff. I'm sure we have seen the balloon blowing. We have seen. So some of the new balloons, you take really hard to push. And some of the softer ones, it's easy to blow. Exactly the same way. The COVID lungs are deemed to be, some are tight, some are not so tight. And there has always been discussion amongst the scientists and from the medical field about how to ventilate the easier ones and how to ventilate the different ones, which means that how to get air into them. So these are all sort of technical terms, but I'm sure now you understood that airflow, unless when you're awake, has to be timed, and it is less so when you're not.
Okay.
Hope that that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Yeah, go on.
Okay.
Vasu.
Okay, this is Vasu here again. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So one piece of revelation based on the questionnaires that came to us is there's something called an ambu bag. So for those of you who are interested, you should stick an ambu bag into your mouth and press the ambu bag without being ready for it. You will feel that your body recoils because the body is not ready to suck that volume of air in. And that's exactly how we expect a human body to recoil when the ventilator is trying to push air in without the body asking for it. And that's where the code has to detect when the human body is asking for air, when the human body is ready to leave out air, and accordingly get the ventilator to work. So with that quick anecdote, we had to translate this medical language that Justin was speaking into the language that we engineers understand. And if you notice at the bottom here, there is a pressure time curve. So as this cartoon shows, when the ventilator is pushing air into a patient's lung, the pressure will change over a period of time. It will go up in the inhalation cycle and then come down in the exhalation cycle. And so if you wanted to convert the medical language into the language that engineers understand, we had to realize that the ventilator has to do the job that the human being does of being able to breathe at about 15 to 20 per minute. The inhalation to exhalation time ratio is of the order of 1 to 2 seconds. So you breathe in for a second, you breathe out in 2 seconds. The pressure at which we push in air has to be less than 30 centimeters of water column above atmospheric pressure. This is a very critical parameter. In a ventilator, the pressure is the equivalent of potential in an electrical circuit. So when the potential goes up, a circuit is liable to get roasted, as you know. So similarly, when pressure goes beyond a certain level, like 30 or 40 centimeters of water column, there can be severe damage to the lungs. And to show you how critical it is, we are living in an atmosphere where the pressure is about 1000 centimeters of water column. So we have only about 10 to 30 centimeters of water column above this limit to control the action of the ventilator. At each breath, we have to push in half a liter of air. That's a lot. And the volumetric flow rate is about 30 liters per minute. Okay. So with that translation of the medical language to engineering language, we started on the 10th of March. We started on the 29th of March. We started on the 19th of March 2020. And on about the 29th of March 2020, we had, oops, okay, I need to go back to my mouse. Just give me a second here. Okay, there you go. And our very first ventilator kind of started working. This is as crude as you can expect a ventilator to be. So this is just a timer circuit that is going on and off and pushing air into a balloon. This is kind of like what you saw in the bellows mechanism that you saw in the previous slide. Okay.
Yeah.
So while this might be crude, it serves to explain what are the parts of the ventilator that are out there, which we call D0. Okay. And this is how product innovation begins. So the parts of a ventilator include the electronics and the control code. This is one key critical part. The pneumatics, through which the gas flows, and the electronics essentially controls the pneumatics. The patient interface, and the fourth part that is not shown here, which is the graphical user interface that the doctor uses in the form of a touch screen. Okay. So we started on the 19th of March 2020. We are today on the 12th of May 2021. And in about 10 days flat, in the midst of COVID, we had to get passes, we had to go through lockdown, buy components. We had put together a version of our ventilator called D1, which was essentially like an on-off switch. It would push a puff of air into a lung or remove it. However, like I just told you, after talking to Justin, we decided we couldn't stop there. As engineers, you know, once you get started, you can't stop. We had to go ahead. And then the reason we had to go ahead was the following. If you plot the pressure profile that you see on the y-axis here, so the talk is getting a little technical here as a function of time. On the x-axis here, you have 0, 3, 6, and 9 seconds. I told you, you take in a breath in about a second and you exhale it in 2 seconds. So the total is 3 seconds. So when you look at the pressure profile, this is the kind of pressure profile we got. However, the pressure profile that we wanted, or that somebody like Justin wanted, even though this is not the exact one, was something like that. So when you say I need to give a pressure pulse at about 20 centimeters of water column, the system can't take its own sweet time to rise up to 20 centimeters of water column. It has to be at 20 centimeters of water column within a few milliseconds. Because when we breathe air and we open our mouths to breathe, nature around us provides air at that pressure instantaneously. It doesn't say from the time you want to start breathing, hold on for half a second before the air pressure comes to atmospheric pressure. So the same applies to ventilators. So at that point in time, of course, Justin sent us some profiles that was there in a hospital in Manipal. And as an aside, you will see here that while we were developing ventilators, other faculty members, and that's the video here, were developing splitters that could be used on a single ventilator that could run multiple lungs. But that's a side story, and you will hear part of it from Harsha as well. So here you can see multiple lungs being run off the same ventilator. The idea was that you could have multiple patients run on the same ventilator. Okay.
That's unusual, is it? That's unusual.
Yes, I mean, ideally you wouldn't do that because different patients have different requirements, and each ventilator is set by the doctor to cater to a single patient. Now, when you put multiple patients on the same ventilator through a splitter, you have to ensure that the patients are kind of more or less in the same state of requirement. Maybe Justin can correct me if I'm wrong, but there are now tools that I see it is there in another organization called Project Prana from MIT. There is also one Project Prana from IISc, where they have developed a splitter that is also smart enough to cater to a patient's requirements. So maybe Justin can add to what I'm going to say. Justin, you want
I think at the end of the day, it is a rescue strategy for us when we run out of ventilators, which is currently happening in Bangalore for sure. Quite a few of us in the medical field are experiencing or hearing stories on a day-to-day basis that the critically ill patients are exceeding the capacity. Most of us have about 60% or max of our ICU beds to have ventilators, and which is the requirement. But now it seems to be that we are exceeding that capacity with the more number of patients needing ICU, at which time we don't have ventilators. And then this was one of the things that we thought when two patients about the same size would turn up, and on the first day of the ventilator of the illness, then we could provisionally put them on with the same setting with a little bit of plus or minus, and hope that the next hour ventilator they could be transitioned to. So that's the idea as a rescue strategy. And there are ways to change the resistance in the system to allow for maybe a little bit more personalized care in it. But I think these are all rescue strategies at this point of time. Thank you.
Okay. So by day 10, we had D1 that was kind of like an on-off machine. By day 17, we had D2, and D2 in this case, if you notice, the on-off valve was replaced by a proportional valve that would allow us better control over these profiles. So while I start this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to request Professor Sushobhan Avasthi to take over from me and discuss the ventilator that we call D2, which is now the progenitor of the ventilator that we are now calling D3. The key point here is you can see that there are now 3 profiles that are now appearing for pressure, volume, and volumetric flow rate. And to see these pressures, sensors also have to be developed. So from this point onwards, for D2, I would like Sushobhan to take over. Sushobhan, on to you. So I'm just going to play this video.
So what we have till now seen is essentially a pneumatic circuit, a simple circuit that can push gas in and out. But very quickly, we realized that probably 80, if not 90% of the ventilator is not the pneumatics, it's actually the support electronics and the control that you can have. And that is only allowed to you because of the modern electronics and embedded systems, essentially a program that you can write that can control that pneumatics. So that is what we started doing. We moved away from a simple timing circuit and moved on to an actual microcontroller based system where we can actually control the various inputs and send and control the various sensors. We also start seeing sensor integration in this version because it's not enough to see have an industrial gate dial that goes up and down. That might have been okay in the 1960s, but in the modern world, Justins of the world are used to seeing a number. And for that, you need sensors. That itself is a parallel story. We didn't actually get a lot of the sensors that we needed. Unfortunately, India doesn't do very well in electronic manufacturing And during the lockdown, several of these sensors were not available. So you see some of these plastic cap type things on the top. Those were sensors that we actually assembled in our labs just for this purpose. But as the lockdown eased, they were replaced by commercial versions that can actually be scaled up. What you actually also see is a computer that is connected. This is just a precursor because ultimately this computer got replaced by a microcontroller that can do all of this intelligence in situ. So once the pneumatic was set up, then we started looking at electronics, and a really important component of that is alarms. Maybe quickly I can go through this circuit. So this is what the circuit typically looks like. Apologies if this is too detailed, but there are essentially two rotometers that control the flow. There is a regulator that reduces the pressure and ensures that any fluctuations at the supply side are not transferred onto the lung. Once again, lungs are very sensitive. It's very easy to puncture it or damage it. Then there is a valve that actually controls this flow. There is a sensor that actually controls, that actually is sent back to the microcontroller, and that controls the flow through this valve. There is a closed loop system here. And then we go ahead and get to the lung. And then on the return path, we again have another set of sensors to see what is coming out, because it turns out that you cannot actually put the lung in the vacuum. The lung always has to be inflated. That means a certain base amount of pressure always needs to be maintained. That is what is called P. And finally, all of this needs to go to the exhaust. Because this is coming out from the lung that is infected, you cannot just vent it out into the air. Otherwise, the ICU is filled with virus. You actually have to connect it to an actual exhaust, put it through some filters and get it out. Vasu, can you go forward? So that is okay. So that is where the D2 starts. Vasu, should I continue, or this is where you take over?
No, you can continue. Do you want to talk about the main parameters that you control and how they result in at least the main modes, the pressure control, the volume control, and PRVC, and how you do the synchronized control, which is important from a patient's perspective?
All right. So Vasu already talked about the various modes and curves, etc., that we generate. So what we need to actually see, what control is the pressure that we are giving during inspiration. That inspiration needs to last for a certain time. Then we need to reduce the pressure to what is the pressure at the expiration, and that needs to be maintained for a certain time. And then we need to keep cycling this. Now, this is the simplest mode of ventilation, and this is called pressure control. The problem with this approach is does not take into account the non-idealities of a lung. A person with COVID or a person with some pathology might not actually have a lung that is very elastic, for a lack of a better word. So when you try to push a lot of pressure into it, it is not elastic, so it doesn't expand. It tries to fight you and then get damaged. A better mode could, in that case, would be that you don't control pressure, but you control volume. What you say is that I'm going to dump, say, half a liter of volume, but I'll control volume. And whatever pressure that takes to send that much amount of volume, that is what we should do. So in that case, you don't just need a pressure meter, but you also need a flow meter. And these flow meters were not at that point easy to make. In fact, we were not able to get any flow sensors in supply. And this is where technology comes in. So Harsha is an expert at 3D printing. So literally 3D printed some flow sensors, integrated them with pressure sensors, and converted pressure sensors into flow sensors. And then those flow sensors were used to actually measure volume and demonstrate what is called a volume control, where a certain amount of volume is pumped inside the lungs. But then that is not the end of the story, as Justin will tell you. What oftentimes people want when you do volume control is there is a fixed amount of volume is flowing through. Lungs elasticity does not remain flat, is not constant during inspiration. So what might happen is when you're trying to push in a flow initially, the lung resists. So there's initially a lot of stress on the lung that with time then diminishes. So a even better control than volume control is something called PRVC, where you try to deliver a fixed volume at the lowest pressure that you can deliver it. And there is the whole intelligence has to be built in so that you can do that, and that causes the least amount of stress on the lung. So all those modes were then had to be developed, and that required a lot of coding and software integration and hardware integration. And on top of that, we need alarms. Best case scenarios are easy. 90% of the time goes into figuring out worst case scenarios. What if the valve doesn't work? What if the sensor doesn't work? What if the pressure is not achieved? What if the volume that we have programmed in does not actually get delivered? Remember, the patient is paralyzed. They are not breathing. Everything that the patient's life is on this machine. If that a few breaths doesn't go to the patient is already halfway into an arrest condition. So you have to make sure that you detect pretty much everything that can go wrong, plan for it, and have elegant ways of handling those cases. So alarm handlings and fault handlings and all of that had then to be coded. Two people very important in all that effort were Prasenjit Sen, who's a faculty colleague. And Saurabh Chandorkar. Saurabh wrote, I think, 80% of the code that supports the system. He is actually an ex-Intel person. He's very good at writing those kind of things. He has made equipment in his previous life. So he actually wrote the code. Again, just not getting into details, but this code cannot be blocking, which that means is you cannot ask to read a sensor and then wait infinite amount of time for that sensor to respond. The system has to continue even if there is something that is happening in the system. So system has to be very intelligent and on the fly. It cannot stop. If there is a fault, we'll figure it out, but the ventilation should continue. Prasenjit Sen wrote the GUI, the graphics interface. So doctors have used to seeing a sort of a touch screen where they can change parameters. You saw an example of it earlier. Those kind of systems take some time to develop. Prasenjit wrote a GUI, I think, in a week. And that is still by and large the GUI we have till today. And the important part there is that we need to show real-time information. There cannot be any lag. The doctor will not tolerate a half of a second lag between the system that he's seeing and what is happening in the patient. So a lot of contingencies have to be resolved to ensure that. Over to you, Vasmed.
Can you hear me?
Most of the hardware was off-the-shelf components, is it? Except those things that you 3D printed and all that?
So we tried to, because the goal was always how to scale it up. So we make a lot of these sensors as a day-to-day research and development, but that is not something I can say is a bill of materials and give it to Vasmed so they can manufacture it. So we tried very hard, but in a lot of cases, critical components were not available. Even proportional valve that you are seeing here, while it is an off-the-shelf component, at that time it was not available. I remember I had to drive with a police pass during the lockdown to Electronic City, and there was just 1 or 2 samples that they just happened to have from Germany, and we got it and we put it in that system. Similarly with pressure sensors, we didn't get the pressure sensors. So for a while we used our own. When the systems opened up, then we got some delivered from Mumbai. So it was a moving target. The situation evolved.
Okay, so the answer to your question, Sujit, is it is true that most of the components are bought off the shelf. And part of the reason we want to do that is we want to buy components that are reliable and certified for medical use. So that if it goes in a ventilator tomorrow, we will have a robust product and they will work reliably. So you may ask the question, so what is it that you guys did if you put together these components of the shelf? Like Sushobhan was pointing out, the key, the heart of the ventilator is the control code. And that having been developed here in IISc now by this team is available for free. And if it does a good job, that is partly what is responsible, as Anoop will tell you later, for our being able to keep the price point of the ventilator to something below 2 lakhs in comparison to like what Justin was pointing out. If you buy a ventilator that's been developed over many years, that costs about 7 to 20 odd lakhs. Please don't misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm in no way saying that those machines are inferior and so on. A lot of hard work has gone in by a lot of smart people to make those ventilators. That control there is probably much better than these controllers. But what we are trying to do is make a cost-effective machine that could be used in emergencies, or if not even in emergencies, for many situations. And while COVID might point to the lack of ventilators in urban centers in India, I'm told that if you go to second-tier cities or even rural hospitals, nobody there has a ventilator because they just can't afford one. So the idea here is to be able to make a ventilator that they can afford, and that comes as close to a current ICU grade ventilator. If I could just quickly add and summarize the tech talk that Sushobhan gave, since it's a Techies talk. In all of these machines, you have to be able to control parameters very precisely. What it means is, if I have to deliver 455 ml of air in a breath, I need a sensor that will sense the flow rate, integrate it over time, the time of inhalation, ensure that it is 455 ml, and if the sensor shows that it is not 455 ml, that feedback is sent through the software, through the control electronics, to a control element that then controls or changes the amount of air that is being pushed into a person. So here what you see in this rough, crude cartoon, which is what we hand drew on our very first day, and this is how again all products start. You know, air and oxygen comes into the system, flow has to be controlled, pressure has to be controlled, and even though it is not seen here, the time over which it happens has to be controlled. And all of this is done by sensors giving a feedback to the control elements. And riding over all of this is a sensor alarm logic that ensures that no untoward incidents happens. So D2 you saw looked like a prototype. That was on the 6th of April 2020, after about 17 days post the 19th of March 2020. By the 6th of June 2020, we had a D2 prototype. But to get to the D2 prototype, there were all kinds of challenges. One of which was, for example, making a flow meter. And that is what Harsha will show you today. Harsha is a master craftsman who is used to doing everything. So he is a PhD student who, along with Ankit Rao, another PhD student, essentially put a ventilator together. And 3D printing technology was a savior. Without 3D printing technology, we couldn't have done anything. If a connector was not available, Harsha would quickly go, create the diagram on a computer, set the printer running overnight, and it would, dish this out for us by the morning, and we would get going. So Harsha, over to you.
Hi Vasu, thank you. Can we move to the next slide? So as Vasu already said that 3D printing was a very important part, and that was doubly because of the lockdown and very few parts were available. So we had parts from here and there, exotic connectors, but we wanted to put together a machine that was working so that we could start testing our control logic. So rapid prototyping came to the rescue. We started off with making splitters, as you saw earlier, and finally the picture on the right is also a mass testing apparatus. But we'll get to the flow measurement part for the ventilator. The next slide also. So flow measurement is a very critical part of ventilation. The idea is that this is something called a venturi tube. It's high school physics, and what happens at the throat is the air accelerates. It's at a higher velocity, which leads to a drop in pressure from the thicker section of the venturi. And what you see is a pressure drop. And this drop is what we measure to, tell us the flow rate. So this is the idea behind it. What we then did was, we needed flow meters. So we designed one of these venturi meters in a CAD software. So next slide, please. Just click. Yeah, so this was a CAD design, and click again, please. Yeah, I should have automated that animation a little more, but finally 3D printed one of these models. And if you go to the next picture, we had one of these venturis, done. And this entire process took about 12 hours. So what I'm trying to highlight here is how fast we can go from just an idea to a working prototype, which we could measure and calibrate to get our flow reading. It's a real instrument in a matter of 12 hours. And if you could click again, Vasu. Here we iterated through a lot of designs, perfecting this, getting the right pressure drops, not restricting flow too much to a point where it could go into a ventilator. And this entire process took about 12 days. So again, we see that we're able to get from, very rudimentary first prototype to something that can go into a machine. Click again, please. So, so this is one part of the process I'd like to highlight here. How rapid prototyping has helped us quickly get a working system. Especially, we've all talked about war footing and how materials were limited. 3D printing came to the rescue to help us get through the initial phases, get a working system, and now we're using off-the-shelf parts, as Vasu said. So next slide sort of highlight.
If I can just quickly add one thing to what Harsha is saying. So here, he first printed this part out, which was a flow meter. But eventually, if you look at it here, he has integrated it into the entire inlet manifold of the ventilator. The entire inlet manifold, which has a lot of complexity, including ports for sensors and so on, was 3D printed. Go ahead, Harsha.
Hi, yeah. So this is what I was trying to really push here, that we were able to go from some just basic principles, this is high school physics, to something that can go into a ventilator in a very short duration by prototyping quick, by experimenting quick, by testing quick, and that helped us make this journey so quickly and so well.
Right. So what Harsha is talking about here is something called as the technology readiness ladder. So it has many steps, and the first 3 steps are the research, at which you get a concept. The next 3 steps are development, at the end of which you get some kind of a product prototype, and eventually deployment, which is scaling up for commercial production, which is what Anoop will be doing over the next 25 days. So post the 6th of April 2020, when D2 was first created, or the prototype of D2 was created, from then it was an arduous journey. Remember, from the 19th of March to the 6th of April, in 17 days, we had made the conceptual ventilator. It, of course, looked like an octopus. But then it took us another 60, 70 days to get to something that would look like a prototype. Okay, so this is what the journey took us from something that looked like an octopus to something that looks like a prototype that we can sell and that works, as is shown in the video at the lower right hand side. And you can see our test lung inflating and deflating as the ventilator is being changed. A lot of things had to be done in the process, like Sushobhan was pointing out. All the electronics had to be integrated into an electronics board. We had to come up with a graphic user interface. Something that is not thought through is the entire thing has to be packaged in a container. And so one has to think through how all of these small items can be assembled inside this container, so that when somebody looks at it, you feel like you want to buy it. And so this shows Harsha and Ankit somewhere in June of 2020 putting this together inside the box, maybe a day or two before. So what then happened? I mean, we had this prototype at the end of June 2020, and then the first wave of COVID subsided and interest was lost. Actually, I would say interest started waning. Everybody went to doing what they were doing, enjoying cricket matches. We were celebrating India beating Australia India beating the Australian cricket team at GABA, but COVID was creeping out upon us. So somewhere in April of this year, about a month ago, I got a SOS call again from Justin saying, hey, that prototype D2, which is half working, can you send it to me? Because my ICU is at about 170% capacity and we are running short on ventilators. So we activated the team once again in April 2021. And this is where we are now. So 2 systems have been assembled, which are at about TRL level 9. This is what the systems look like. It looks much more polished. And as we speak, I think 2 of these systems should have been sent out for certification today. And the targeted cost, give or take a few, is about 1.5 lakhs. And to take us through this journey of how it is going to go from where we are into the market in terms of numbers, I invite Anoop Varghese. By the way, before we get to Anoop, we also sent this to Justin at Manipal, where the doctors looked at it and they came back and told us that, look, you have to change a few things. We've done that. And now we have the prototype that's ready for scale up. So Anoop, over to you. Okay, sorry, if you don't mind. Yeah. So in about the next 15 days, we have to go from 2 to about 25 to 30 in number. The team meets every day religiously at 7 o'clock in the evening. It's an hour-long meeting where every nitty-gritty is hammered down. Sushobhan is the guy who coordinates it, including things like, do you have that size of screw? Because if you don't have that size of screw, it will not bolt into the system. We've been working with Vasmed. There was another company that helped us with the pneumatics gas technologies, and Intertech will be the certification agency. So sorry about that. But with that, Anoop, over to you on the scale up.
So basically, one of the challenges with regard to any medical device is how we ensure the safety and efficacy of the device into the field. So especially like a critical care device like ventilator, it needs to be very important that we need to make sure that right from the beginning itself, the design is meeting to various standards. So there are some guidelines and standards that has been announced that is available from various agencies like International Electrical Commissions, ISO, etc. So the most important thing while we were all looking at the technical side is also to make sure that this technology, what we are developing, it can be used and can be adapted to a hospital environment where device should be reliable. It should be whatever we claim on the device, it is able to deliver. So that is where we were looking at right from the beginning in terms of from our limited contribution was primarily to make sure that the device is meeting to these standards. So there are a few standards that we were working on. And we made sure that because if you make a mistakes in terms of the design itself right from the beginning, and when we come towards the certification time, if there is an error, we are going back right from the square one in many cases. So what we, for this ventilator, right from the beginning, the team had been looking into various standards and making sure that there is an adherence to standard guidelines right from selection of materials. And that is where some of the standard materials itself we were selecting, that is, it is a medical grade material, the alarm handling, and also the critical performance of the ventilator, the ability of it to deliver exactly what the amount of air that it claims to be. So I will just cover a little bit more on that in the next slide. But here what we are looking at is mainly in terms of around the main three components of the ventilator is the electronics, the pneumatics, and the fabricated components. Like it was explained, many of the components were fabricated in-house, and we are looking at how to scale that up. And almost you can see on the right side of this how much is the percentage of each. But by most of the majority of the components are indigenously from local sourcing itself. So we have assembled the device, the selection of the material, bill of materials, etc. is mostly from the local sourcing. Yes, there are a few electronic components like Sushobhan was saying, there is a limited electronic components available in India, but we are sourcing that from outside. Some filters we are sourcing, but majority is right now from Indian manufacturers itself. And most of the supply chain was established along the development of these ventilators. And we are working towards that aggressive timeline of the 25 units by end of May. From Vasmed, we are sponsoring some, other companies are also sponsoring some. But our objective is to make sure that it touches the market at the earliest. So everybody is working towards that. And also we need to make sure that all the steps are right, like so that the final assembly is exactly as envisaged by the technical team. Can we go to next slide, please? So like I was saying that the safety of the ventilator, that like Dr. Justin was saying, it should do no harm. So we ensure that primarily by giving it undergoing certain certifications. This is just some highlighted certifications which I was referring to, but there are more than 15 standards that we have to abide for a critical care ventilator, which we were running along the way. And ensures that each of this ensures that the safety of the patient, the efficacy of delivering the therapy, and every risk, like once the ventilator is onto the patient, we have to foresee, before that itself, we have to foresee what can go wrong. So that kind of risk management was ensured on this kind of development. And again, sourcing and selection of the components, one of the challenges is that this is a higher oxygen-rich environment. And also we don't want any components or leaching of many materials that can go to the patient. So selection of the materials is also very critical. And that is where we went for standardized materials instead of very novel materials so that it is safe to use. And then comes into our side, we are an ISO 13485 certified company. And our objective is to make sure that every manufacturing is happening in a controlled environment and there is a full traceability. So if something goes wrong, we can go back and trace out where that went wrong. So that level of traceability we ensures in terms of the production. And above all, one of the key things will be that this is not a product that is just used for a couple of months. The device is designed and its reliability component should cover up for multiple years. So the reliability is a key aspect in terms of these products. And few challenges we are looking at is now we have the device, we are working on a certification also, but making sure that how to scale it up from the 25 numbers. Like we are target of cost of around 1.5 lakh, but again, we need to make sure that it can be supported after that and how to scale it up to the next 100 numbers. That is the next challenge we are working on.
Are you done?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So
you're confident of this 1.5 lakh, Anoop? You can make enough, margins are included there in your 1.5 lakh.
This is, we are right now from a company itself, we are looking at a non-profit as a organization for this, and at least for the initial COVID period. So we're looking at the BOM plus whatever is the basic requirement for covering the cost at this moment, because the objective right now is how to reach it to the market than in terms of the profitability. So from right away, we have been working this as a critical because the number of ventilators available in India is very limited, and we have seen that many hospitals have this challenge with regard to the ventilators. So the objective is to reach it to the market, and we need to make sure that the costs can be kept as low as possible.
So Vasu, basically, you said you're not going to patent this, is it? You're going to open source it in some sense. I mean, anybody can use it.
Yeah, I mean, the ventilator and concentrator technologies, etc., are very well known. So I don't think from the point of view of an inventive step, which is what is required for a patent, we haven't come up with anything new that we can patent. But what it is, we definitely have is a control code, which is completely original, which is ours, which we would prefer to keep in the form of know-how and give it to companies such as Vasmed, which we believe can produce this machine in a responsible fashion. Because if it is not produced in a responsible fashion, it can do more harm than it can do good.
Okay. Are there more slides, Vasu?
We are almost done. I realize we are at 7 o'clock.
Yeah, we are.
So this is the story. We started in the 19th of March 2020. In about 10 days, we had come up with our first octopus. In about 17 days, we had come up with our second octopus. In a few months, we had come out with our first prototype. In about a year, even though we could have done it before, we have come up with the second prototype. This is where we are now. The prototype has been doctor evaluated, and one more member of our team, Professor Akshay Naik, who's been after us from day one to get it certified and tested, is working on sending it for certification. And our target is to go from here. Today is the 12th of May 2020, to have about 25 units ready by the 30th of May 2022. So thank you. And if you have any questions, you can direct it to me, or you can also direct it to any member of the team. Sushobhan Avasthi, who has been the ringleader for the last many months, will help coordinate that. Thank you.
I just have one question. I mean, so why do the others sell at 7 to 20 lakh versus your 1.5?
I think I kind of answered that question in between, right? So it takes a lot of time to develop this code. Okay, and of course, the other ventilators also have more bells and whistles built in, more sensors, and so on and so forth. And our aim is to get a ventilator that will either be just an emergency ventilator, it will still help save patients, but it did not have all the highest end bells and whistles. And like I was saying, that the code is the heart of the ventilator, and that having been developed by IISc, we are, giving it out for free. And so given that know-how, which is being given out for quote unquote free, let me put it that way, free for all practical purposes, I believe is what is partially helping us keep this cost down.
But the other point was that during the early phase of pandemic, nobody was sending any of their stuff out because we were importing all our ventilators 100%. Right. And most countries stopped their exports from both Europe and North America. So essentially, we were left out with no choice but to make our own. And I think that's probably where the main point of the drive came for the team in those early days. Yeah.
Just to add to that, from a medical device company, whenever we go for a new development, we are talking about a long period of time, like a couple of years to get it tested. So there is a lot of investment that goes through here. So that is what is coming as a recovery in many of the products that is coming, so that that continuity can be maintained for future products also. But here the team has done an amazing job in making sure that all the requirements are met right away with minimal redoing also that is required. So that also helps keep the cost down.
Shilpa?
Yeah, I mean, the entire manpower, I mean, the entire team of, I think, I don't know what, 60 odd people is for free for a period of, 2 years. So that's about, 120 man years.
If I can just add to that, there's also an upfront investment in infrastructure, like for our department, right? I mean, the 3D printer was available, the basic pneumatic systems were available, we already had systems to calibrate a pressure sensor and oxygen sensors. And I think because we are a research establishment and government and other sources have sort of created that infrastructure that then can be leveraged. So that creation of infrastructure, the creation of the manpower, people like Harsha, etc., that is what allows you to then quickly develop things. If you don't make those investments upfront, then it will not happen within 15 days.
Right. That's actually a very valid and important point. The entire infrastructure, and it takes a lot to run IISc, and we are of course supported by the government and the Center of Nanoscience and Engineering, which has been supported by MITI, the Ministry for Electronics and Information Technology, and now DST and MHRD as well, where this fantastic infrastructure has been set up, which partly is what helped us make all these sensors in quick time. So all that upfront investment is there made by the government. So all of that doesn't need to get amortized, which it will have to happen in the case of a commercial ventilator, I guess.
Yeah. Shilpa?
So Raghavan, from a commercialization standpoint, have you set up a company internally to market it? Would it be co-branded as an IISc product? If you can talk about it, because you have only named it as D2, D3. So what is the final product?
Well, you're talking to engineers, right? So if you're a Star Wars fan, they named their robot R2D2. We will probably come out with a name, but there have been many floating around. There is a licensing model available with IISc that has currently been executed with Vasmed. It's a non-exclusive license, and like I said, we are open to doing similar licensing models with other companies that would like to come forward and scale up production. And in particular, I mean, I must congratulate Vasmed, because it's not like Vasmed is a very big company. Their board has taken the step to do this upfront investment to make 10 modules on their own. And like I said, we are hopeful of getting funds to do the next 15. And anybody who is willing to help fund Vasmed scale it up further, to especially tide over this current situation, such funding is extremely welcome.
Dr. Justin, you're already using one or two of these prototypes in Manipal?
So at this point of time, most of these are what we call as a yet to be certified machinery, and probably will only be used in extraordinary circumstance when there is no other equipment available. But for the benefit of the patient, that these can be used in a clinical use. But they will probably become a lot more standard of care should they go through the certification, and that's why the rush that is happening at this point with the IISc and Vasmed, getting through the required certifications for safety. We know that it works, but we have to make sure that it is legally safe.
So does that mean testing it on patients and all that, or
yes. I think it will be patient use once it is certified. So they are safe to be used in patient care. It is not considered to be safety, but I mean, like every tablet and like every vaccine, there is always what we call as a post-marketing survey, post-marketing safety work. So when we use it and we still find something that is picked up in the safety work, yes, that goes back to the drawing board to sort it out, but just like every other medicine. But at this point of time, once it goes through the safety, it is good for use for patient care.
Oh, just to maybe add to that, so what we mean by certification and testing in this case is that some third party, which is not an interested party like IISc or Vasmed, who are emotionally invested in the system, but a third party who is disinterested in the system, who will abuse and use it to ensure that there are no cases or corner cases where the system will misbehave. That is not done on a patient, that is done with machines. There are calibration systems and setting systems. Once that is done, then I think Justin takes over, and then there is some ethical clearance and says there's also governmental approvals involved. So there are several moving parts to it. But the first goal would be to get it deemed safe by a third disinterested party.
So just to add to that, there are some international standards which I had referred. So it is about testing against those standards and making sure. So we are already engaged with Intertech in terms of getting that tested closed. I think within the next couple of weeks, it should be closed.
So if all goes well, how long would it take to finally be used on patients properly? I mean, as a final product?
As I see it, I think by the end of the month is what the target is at this point. Ambitious, but I think if the track record to go by were the D1, D2s, I think they've been able to achieve it. What most of the industry achieved in months to years, they've achieved in hours to days. So I'm pretty sure that we are pretty close to that.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like the code and all that software you could write in just a few weeks. I mean, that's remarkable, isn't it? I mean,
well, it took a lot of iteration, and many team members haven't slept or did not even sleep in days back then, and both over the last 2 months.
They were doing more night duties than me. That made me think, okay, there are some people who are working harder than me.
Very good. Excellent.
So I believe when it came to this year, and I again apologize for this mistake here, it's 2021, not 2022. From the time Justin called us, I think, Justin, we were able to, the team worked hard, worked through 2 nights. I think Sushobhan didn't sleep. And in about 48 hours, we sent across the first unit to Manipal, right? For you to have a look at it.
Wow.
And again, one of the things with regard to the code itself is that the team was there right in front of the machines, making sure that it is tested then and there against a calibrated tester, so that every feedback was caught and made sure that it is done. So that level of detailing that done by the team is amazing. And from our side, usually it is a month's effort that we take for such a development. But what the team has achieved is phenomenal.
That's actually that's an interesting point. And now that you mention it, actually one of the things is that we are an interdisciplinary department. So Vasu does pneumatics, I do electronics, Saurabh wrote the code, Prasanjit wrote the GUI, but we all sort of understand each other's language because we come from different streams, but we sit in the same room. While on the other hand, what I think happens in companies is the software development people sit in the separate room, maybe in a separate building from people who do electronics, and then that circle is harder to close. But for us, it was just a hop and skip away.
Because like Sushobhan pointed out, we do this as part of our regular research. So we are used to understanding each other's language more easily. And that helped too. Yeah.
We have a question from Alex Kaushik. For understanding of a layperson, what medical stats/vital stats would warrant the patient to be on a ventilator? This is for Dr. Justin.
So I'm sure, it doesn't take much for a layperson, and you don't have to be a really specialist to see a panting, gasping patient. At box standard, and you know that he's very sick. I know he's not gonna do well if you leave him like that. I'm sure that's the basic what we call as a numbers game you can see. And then when you go about it, what we want to do is that we want to catch a patient who hasn't come to that yet, and we know that he's coming to that. So that's the goal of it, is that we want to use ventilator not as a last resort, but as a way that they shouldn't get to that last resort. So we use it a little bit ahead when we know that the trend at the end of the day, we monitor the patients. It doesn't have to be the absolute number. So when the trend is on the upscale, you catch them there so that they are not too tired or they haven't overworked their lungs. So that the ventilator actually gives them a break, so that and the sedation anesthesia would allow their body to not work so hard. Like we spend nearly 40% of our body energy when we are with the severe COVID pneumonia and panting on just the breathing muscles. So that amount of energy goes in. And I'm sure some of the people will realize if you have any COVID recovered patients, their breathing isn't not normal even after 6 weeks. It's just because the body takes away so much, and it's a little bit atypical kind of disease, the COVID. But the idea is that the box standard, yes, the sick-looking patient who is panting and gasping, and then their obviously oxygen numbers are in beeping. Any monitor says beeping is a box standard first one to go, and the more sophisticated way is to look at their worsening trend. Somebody is getting more and more breathless, or more and more issues, or their trend of oxygen, the way how much is dropping, or the amount of oxygen that they had to get as over a period of time is increasing rapidly. And we know that if the curve continues for another 12 hours, they would land up with much worse situations. So we intervene now, and that we don't put the body through that increasing exercise. At the end of the day, ventilator does not cure your lungs, but it buys you just enough time so that the lungs go through that peak, and then when it's coming down, you allow the lungs and the ventilator to integrate and come through. Hope that explains.
Yeah. Vasu, can you stop sharing that, please? So that otherwise, so that viewers can see everybody's faces. Yeah. Okay. So the difference between an oxygen concentrator and ventilator is that, I mean, the person in an oxygen concentrator, a person should be able to breathe, while in this case, the person is finding it difficult to breathe.
So the oxygen concentrator is something that provides or generates oxygen, whereas ventilator does not. So the ventilator needs with it, it sends air in and out, but it needs a supplemental oxygen. So whereas a concentrator is just supplementing whatever you're breathing, oxygen to your own normal breathing. So ventilator in itself is not a producer of oxygen, it is a consumer of oxygen to help you.
Okay.
Yeah. So it takes supplemental. Yeah. So whereas the concentrator is a simple enriching device. That means we just enrich the whatever that we breathe. Whereas the ventilator is a device which is in an advanced mode where it not only enriches but also makes sure that air is gone in and that air comes out more or less in the same way. Our breathing is passive. We only breathe in. We don't breathe out unless we make an effort. It just like a balloon, it just blows out. So even that has to be controlled. So all these things happen with the ventilator. So there are different dimensions to it, and ventilator does consume oxygen, unlike concentrator.
Just to maybe add one comment to that, ventilator in some sense is a more critical care device. You would not have a layperson or a home user ever use a ventilator. That would be remarkably unsafe. While a concentrator is a more passive device that theoretically, if you make it small enough, you can have in a portable in your own home.
Right. Okay.
One of my friends, colleagues from Ahmedabad told me that one of his patients came with his ventilator to the ICU. I have had requests in Bangalore by a couple of people to buy which ventilator they should buy and keep it there. So it is possible that lay people will come with ventilator.
Will come with it. Shilpa, can end this then. Is there anything else anybody wants to say? Vasu, any final words?
Harsha can give you a live feed.
Okay.
Yeah, I can show you the.
So while he is doing that, let me quickly summarize our story. So if you want to go from a concept to a product, you need to build a team. And in this case, the concept to product was a ventilator. So we built a team of scientists. We realized we need a team of doctors. And we realized we need a team of biomedical production professionals like Anoop. Without them, it's impossible. And within the team in IISc, we needed people who understood pneumatics, electronics, software, GUI, and of course, a lot of energetic students. So that is one of our products that is going to go into testing or certification tomorrow. And it is running this artificial lung that you see in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And this lung, you can actually change its settings to mimic human lungs with different degrees of elasticity and ensure that the ventilator works well for all of them. So that is where the code needs to be tuned well. And that's not something that can be done easily. So that is where the code master comes in. And I think Saurabh was one of the code masters, and eventually Sushobhan polished it up.
Okay. Dr. Justin, is it easy to train people to use this quickly?
I guess we have in a critical care setup, we are used to ventilators, and even though Vasu keeps saying that we demand a lot, obviously we have had high-end ventilators for quite some time. So, and I keep asking for more. I guess each time I meet them, so more coding, more that, more this, and I want this wave isn't quite right. See how we can flatten it out. So I guess
Okay.
in a way, for these machines are part and parcel of day-to-day life. So and we have seen over the last 20 years more and more generation of ventilators that came through. So we are, and this is a sleek touch screen, almost as modern as a recent multinational company ventilator.
Okay, wonderful.
I think that's Harsha from inside his lab in IISc.
Yeah, I also was about to tell the viewers that's just seeing the IISc lab.
I can also show you the ventilator. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Wonderful.
Great.
Okay.
So I hope we made sense. And I hope
absolutely. Absolutely. Wonderful product. Wish you all the best. We all hope that this product comes to market quickly. Shilpa?
Yeah, more power to all of you. Professor Raghavan, one last question. You have an alias called the gas guy. If you can just give us, how did you earn that?
Oh, that's because I do a lot of chemical vapor deposition in which we have to control flows of gases. And we handle the pneumatics. Of course, now I think Sushobhan is as good at it as I am. And our group handled the pneumatic part of the ventilator. And when this whole problem came to fore, this is what I told myself. I said, look, I control gas flows in much more advanced systems day in and day out. Can't I build a ventilator? And that's how it all got started in some ways in my head. And then I realized that the human body is a completely different ballgame. Much more difficult to run gases through a human body and out without damaging it. And I would say this is probably the most challenging pneumatic circuit that I have worked on in the last 20 odd years. It's just mind-boggling. We take it for granted. We live in this ocean of air that is around us, and we just open our mouth and we gulp in half a liter at about 30 SLPM per minute in a second without thinking about it. And it's very, very difficult to implement in a lab. I mean, running 30 liters per minute takes a lot of, jugglery, all kinds of electronic components. So our body is amazing. And to get a machine to do that is very difficult, very difficult. We learned a lot along the way. And my respect for biomed professionals and doctors went up exponentially during this process.
Oh, great. On that note, here is to the gas guy, to the master controller, master craftsman, Harsha, to Dr. Justin, Anoop, more power to you and wishing you success in the ventilator project. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you all.
Bye.